Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Sex Sales Podcast, the podcast where we talk about relationships, culture, and dating from a male and female perspective. Today we're talking about the limits of empathy. Can you possibly be too empathetic? Is there a point in which empathy becomes a hindrance? And we're going to get cracking on that at the 3-minute mark. Before we get onto that, we got an announcement. Since so many of you loved the YouTube format of this so much, you loved the comment discussion, we have decided to start a YouTube channel. And the YouTube channel is youtube.com/@sexsalespodcast. So go and subscribe. youtube.com/@sexsalespodcast. We're going to just be posting the full Sex Sales video podcast as well as a few highlights eventually. And we want to build that up. So it's pretty awesome that you guys love the discussion. And thank you for all the messages. Egging us on to get that video back up. Couldn't resist seeing our faces. We're also sponsored by Comedy Untamed. If you want to come see a great stand-up comedy/improv show in Sydney, Melbourne, or Newcastle, go to comedyuntamed.com. I'm there at most of the Sydney shows, some of the Melbourne shows, most of the Newcastle shows. We got a Geelong show in the works, and we're hoping to open a Brisbane show later this year. So a lot of people are coming down to the show, very different to last year with all the rain. So thank you guys if you've already come down, and keep coming. We're also sponsored by Crush Organics. Crush have a huge range of CBD oil products. I've been using the pain cream for my sciatica, and it works a treat. Loosens up the muscles, relaxes everything. You can use it on any sore muscles, on any muscle, and it'll increase the blood flow going there. So go to crushorganics.com, use the code Neel, and you will get 40% off. If you've never tried CBD oil before, make sure you just read all the labels and start off with just a little bit. We're also going to be stopping the subscription model at the end of February. So if you're a subscriber, stay tuned for either an email or potentially just the subscription pausing, and then we're going to a one-off cost model if you'd like to send in a question, a topic, or a shout-out. Okay, I got most of that in before the 3-minute mark. As I said before, we're going to be talking about empathy, and let's get into it. Eliza, how are you?
I'm pretty good. Same old. How are you? How have you been?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. Can't complain. Enjoying the summer weather. It's not raining anymore, which is always nice.
Yeah. What have you been up to otherwise? Working?
Yeah, just working. Just doing what I usually do. Doing the shows, managing all that. Doing the podcasts and videos, and yeah, nothing really new to report. Few interesting relationship stories happening in my friend group and also in my girlfriend's friend group, but they're a bit too personal and heated right now. So maybe stay tuned for the debrief on that on a later podcast.
Damn, I love that stuff. You got me instantly excited, and then
I just took it away. Yeah, I've started watching Maths again, but it's not hitting this season. You know, it's just not doing it for me.
It's just like outrageously bad.
Yeah, it's very forced. I mean, it is entertaining, and it's pretty cool that it's gained traction across the world. Maths has become the Geordie Shore of Australia, where people just get to look at the most interesting specimens of the land down under interacting in a relational context. And it's a lot like observing zoo animals. So I definitely enjoy that aspect of it. It's pretty funny.
True that.
All right. Well, like I said, today we're going to be talking about empathy and whether it gets to a point where it becomes a hindrance. I thought there was this cool little quote that I read in an article about the limits of empathy. In fact, it says, "Empathy often leads people astray. It influences people to care more about cute victims than ugly victims. It leads to nepotism. It subverts justice. Juries give lighter sentences to defendants that show sadness. It leads us to react to shocking incidents, like a hurricane, but not long-standing conditions, like global hunger or preventable diseases. So I thought that's a good quote to jump into this topic. And this was your idea, so tell me a bit about why you wanted to talk about this.
Well, I came across something really interesting. On Reddit, I saw someone make a comment about this, and then I looked into it and I found out about this man called James Fallon, and he was he's in his late 60s, or maybe he's in his 70s now, but he's a neuroscientist, a top neuroscientist, and he actually studied the brains of psychopaths. So he went and interviewed them in prisons, he did all the assessments, he got brain scans, he did all these things, and then coincidentally at the same time, he was also submitting his own brain scans to study Alzheimer's. And upon getting results of his, the Alzheimer's study brain scans, he saw a set of brain scans that were so shocking. And he said, these brain scans, who do they belong to? They align perfectly with the studies I'm doing on psychopathic traits. And they said, those are your traits, those are your brain scans. So he then found out that he had all the traits of a psychopath. Which, isn't actually a formal diagnosis. The diagnosis is antisocial personality disorder. But I did a bit of a little dive into this guy, and it's so fascinating because when he started talking about psychopaths and their brains, his mum pointed out to him, like, honey, have you looked at yourself? And then talked about their family tree and that they have a lot of murderers in his family, all these, a lot of trauma and things like that. And basically what he found from his studies was that the trait that comes across with people that have psychopathic symptoms, it's inherited from your mother, and then it can be, I guess, for lack of a better word, unlocked by a significant childhood trauma event, like really severe trauma event. So people that have the trait without the trauma may just be a little bit more highly intelligent, charismatic, yet cold, and can make higher risk-taking decisions. But when people that have that trait or gene, unlocked by some kind of trauma, it can very easily evolve into high levels of violence, etc., as the people he studied, he found. And so when he discovered that he had this trait himself, he went and spoke to a lot of people, and he did conferences across the world and with neurosurgeons, neuroscientists, psychiatrists, all these people. When he put his brain scans up, everyone was shocked and talked about them. And in other countries, people would say, he also has bipolar. But in America, his brain scans didn't or he also didn't qualify to have bipolar. So it's interesting how it's different amongst countries, what I guess the criteria for it. Anyway, so he then went and spoke to everyone he knew, and every single person was like, yeah, this is so
You're
obvious. Yeah, like it's pretty,
Wow.
it's pretty clear. He was known to be brutal, kind of lack empathy, yet he did some of the most significant and amazing research and findings in the world, and what we know today about psychology and things like that. So in I guess the point is that he had such a significant part of and contribution to society despite not being neurotypical. And I guess when empathy kind of comes into this as well is that he spoke about how he has like a lot of narcissistic traits, extremely highly inflated ego, and he spoke about how if someone does him wrong, one of the things is he has to gain revenge. And he said a normal person will get mad, they'll stay mad for a day or a week or whatever. He said, I can stay the same level of angry for 5 years if someone wrongs me. And he said, I will wait and plan the perfect time and I will execute revenge on them always. But they'll never know it's from me. It'll seem like a random life event. They probably don't even remember who I am, but I will always get my revenge. And then he kind of softens it by saying, but I only do it to the same extent that they wronged me. So he never goes above and beyond. It keeps the field
What a nice
even.
guy.
He's so lovely. And he speaks about how he relates strongly to Dexter, and he felt that that was a good representation of it. And he said, there's a lot of things that I can't really talk about my past and that my family don't know about. But people see me as like this charming, extremely smart neuroscientist, and he's married as well. I don't know if he has kids. I can't remember.
I bet you he has a few across the country as well.
Maybe he wouldn't care. And he said, as an experiment and as part of his ego, he thought, well, I'm going to prove that you can outsmart it and you can overcome it or whatever, which he couldn't. But he feigned empathy, and he feigned compassion. And all of a sudden, people around him were much more receptive to him. People were talking about the difference, saying they really liked him. His wife was much happier. And he even told his wife, by the way, I'm faking this. Like, I don't I'm not actually concerned for you. I'm just pretending to be. And she actually said, I don't care. Like, this just feels so nice.
Isn't that interesting?
Which is sad. And he said, yeah, and it's interesting to think like how their marriage lasted this long and was so successful, because he'd say, if there was someone in the family that died, I wouldn't go to their funeral because I didn't want to. Like, I couldn't be bothered. I'd go to a party. I'd go do something more fun. Like, he didn't do anything he didn't want to do. Yet people just thought maybe it was because he was such a highly intelligent, high-earning person that he was cocky or whatever. But really, he had the same traits as a psychopath. So it kind of got me thinking about there are so many benefits as well to people that are neurodiverse. And maybe having empathy isn't the be-all, end-all and isn't actually an essential needed part of society functioning. Well, it is, but maybe not for every single person. So yeah, that kind of got me down this little rabbit hole.
Yeah, well, men should fake empathy and women should fake orgasms, and then that's how you create a happy marriage.
Done.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much.
Empathy is an interesting one because in a interpersonal context, it's vital, to have long-term healthy relationships with your friends and with your partner and with just the people in your social structure. You need to have a degree of empathy, but there is a point at which it becomes, well, there was this article as well that was talking about how it becomes performative. So empathy can be a feeling that you express that allows you to feel a sense of virtue, but it doesn't necessarily result in anything. For example, we see a lot of this online now with performative social justice. Hey, I feel for these people. I'm going to post something about it because that's me expressing how empathetic I am. Well, awareness only affects outcomes to a certain degree. There are different contexts in which awareness and mass awareness from social media can be effective, but it also can it can become actually an indicator of narcissism, or maybe a self-absorbed nature if you're constantly posting about how empathetic and virtuous you are without necessarily doing anything. I think, as you say, society has like an ideal point of empathy, and I guess what I observe right now is that politically it seems to be far more lopsided in terms of which side uses empathy the most or sees empathy as a higher order value. When you look at, I guess, the progressive side of politics, if you want to call it the left, the cultural left, whatever, it's definitely puts empathy really high on their hierarchy of values. But to the extent where it could actually be detrimental, it's sometimes very hard for groups on the progressive left to form a structure with authority and a hierarchy, which can actually be advantageous to that group in the long term. And then I suppose you look at something like the military or a militaristic operation, and that's where all empathy and all sense of individual nature and individual essence are completely eroded. And you have to submit to the authority and you have to work as a unit, and your sense of self is absolved for the aims of the group. And I wonder if, throughout history, populations that could actually turn on and off their empathy, if that makes sense, had an advantage over populations that couldn't, because in chimp society, they're not particularly empathetic, particularly the males in chimp society, whereas you look at bonobos, they're extremely empathetic and more maternal or feminine as a society. And we're both human beings are equidistant from both of these ape species, and yeah, it makes me think how much of these dark triad or now dark tetrad traits are just turned on due to the environment and can actually be advantageous. I mean, if someone is brought up in a situation where no one offers them empathy and they have to be very cold, callous, and calculating to survive and to thrive, it makes perfect sense that that gene would sort of be switched on, and that can be very helpful for them. And then I think something we were talking about in a podcast a couple of weeks ago, where the archetypes in a lot of female romantic literature are often these kind of dark tetrad type guys who are extremely powerful or have the capacity for power and aggression and violence even, but they have that under control. Because like with the guy you were talking about, often people who can maybe turn off their empathy or have less of it, but then are also highly intelligent and motivated and conscientious, are often the most successful people, particularly in certain industries. I guess on that sort of political scale, you can almost see an industry scale like that, where I always talk about how the arts is very much focused on the individual and the inner world, and the manifestation of that inner world in the form of your art. Whereas again, something like the military is like the complete opposite of that, at least from my observation. And yeah, it's very interesting, the sort of the range of empathy within a society, and how that empathy can even be weaponized against the population and against a person. And we have that identifier of empath that a lot of people still tend to use, and we've had things to say about those people on previous podcasts as well. But yeah, it is very interesting, and I wonder if today we're at a point where maybe there's an abundance of empathy, at least on social media, at least what we sort of strive for. But the actual objective reality, or like the way that we can offer compassion to marginalized or people who have been hard done by a certain society, is not necessarily just empathy. Sometimes the compassionate thing to do is tough love and harsh restrictions, and that actually helps a group or a person in the long term. Whereas just indulging in your sense of empathy can sometimes just make that individual person feel good, and the arbiter of that empathy, feel good. Both of them feel good in the moment, but then nothing actually changes. So I could go and walk past a homeless person and feel a strong sense of empathy, which I generally do, unless they're yelling profanities. Or a few weeks ago in Melbourne, a guy had his dick out just pissing on the road, as you do. It's a bit hard to have empathy in that context, but just feeling empathy doesn't necessarily do anything. It just makes you feel a bit good about yourself. So what moving on to how that maybe that discussion can manifest on a societal level, or how we can best utilize empathy and find the ideal point for us as individuals, but also as a population. What are your broad thoughts on that?
Firstly, when you talk about, when we think about empathy and why it exists, firstly, we need it to look after our young and our babies, first and foremost, to continue the population. And I feel like I'm reading a book. I can't even remember what it's called. I think it's actually called The Empathy of Love, or just Empathy. I'll find out and post it on my Instagram story or something. But it is about how you need empathy in order to raise effective and productive children to make positive members of society. At least one positive, empathetic, not positive, but at least one empathetic caregiver needs to have empathy in order to raise children to live a more fulfilling life. That is for neurotypical children, though. They didn't say much about raising, the essential of empathy when raising neurodiverse children or whatever. But also, so there's that. And there's also that we needed empathy in order to survive in our tribes back in the day. So social connection and agreement was so essential. Otherwise, there'd be conflict all the time, fighting, death. So empathy was essential then. And then I've seen things, like you said now, about like, well, we no longer need empathy to survive in tribes, so do we need this level of empathy that we have currently? And then you also think about, people that are neurodiverse. It's relatively new. Like it's not new to be neurodiverse, but it's new to understand neurodiversity and to understand that you may have it. And when you think about that from an aspect of being in tribes, I believe that, you may have needed majority, say 80% of people to have high levels of empathy, and you may need people to be neurodiverse to make different decisions, make more risk-taking decisions. Not that neurodiverse people don't have empathy. In fact, some people with autism have extremely higher levels of empathy. I know a lot of people that are vegan that have autism because it's just they cannot envision any harm to any being. But an interesting study I came across where they did a survey of people to understand who may have, say, antisocial or psychopathic traits. And once they got those on who does or who doesn't, they gave them a secondary test, which was a virtual reality one, where they had to choose between either basically they're in a group of people, they have a soldier with them that's severely injured, and you have to decide, do you carry the soldier with you and risk getting captured and killed, or do you kill an already severely injured soldier and move on and escape with a much higher chance of surviving? And what they found is that almost all the empathetic people that rated high in empathy wanted to save the soldier and bring him along too. And although when I think about it logically, I'm like, I would think about sacrificing it, but I wouldn't. I'd probably be the one advocating the most, being like, well, let's bring him. But they found that people that had antisocial personality traits or psychopathic traits were much more likely to make the logical decision, saying this person needs to be killed. And what was interesting, though, is that as part of the virtual reality, they actually had to act it out. Like they had to do the act, which seemed quite real. Considering technology advancements, blah, blah. And the people that had psychopathic traits acted it out fast, swiftly, emotionless, and it was just there was a strong purpose to it. It's done, and it's bettered the whole community and the whole group that they're with, and they move on. So it didn't say much about the people that had high levels of empathy that decided, okay, we need to kill this person, and how they acted that out. But I'm sure it was pretty distressing, even though it was virtual reality. But yeah, I just thought that was quite interesting. And what you were saying as well about how I definitely, coming into this industry that I work in now, I've previously working with, in child protection, youth homelessness, family breakdown, like really strong cases of families that need a lot of support and also a lot of abuse and violence and things like that. I went into this industry because of me having high levels of empathy. Otherwise, if I didn't have this high level of empathy, I probably wouldn't put myself through some of the things I've had to go through, and see past that. And in some ways, it's really benefited me to have these high levels of empathy. And whether or not that's from a logical point or a selfish point, I'm not quite sure. Like when I had a workplace assault, I had an injury for 9 months, a really severe back injury. But it helped me to process it, thinking this person that did this to me was so they had drug addiction issues. They were so, hard done by society. They had little to no support. So many things that were happening for that person. I could understand why they had targeted me, and they also had probably they were having a mental health episode, so they weren't in their correct mind frame. But like you said, there were times when I first went into the industry, when I started working and I was 19, and I was working in a youth center, and we had a lot of kids that were vulnerable coming in. And I was so empathetic towards them, and I wanted to save them all. And my God, did I try. And it took me maybe 3 or 4 years of working in this industry before I realized I'm actually not doing them the service that I think I'm doing by finding them accommodation, by finding them jobs for them, by reaching out to their families and with their consent, of course, and trying to resolve things. I needed to be teaching them those skills to do it themselves. It's like, what's that Bible quote? Like, give a man a fish and he'll eat for 3 days, or teach a man to fish and he can survive. I don't know, something like that. It's very much like that. And I realized it was, what is the secondary gain here for me to be kind of putting all these people and all these clients and kids under my wings and trying to save them. And I have also done the same in my relationships as well. There is a secondary gain there. Whether or not I was acknowledging it at the time, I was very much, no, I'm doing this out of the pure goodness of my heart. And although sometimes I still think that, there is a secondary gain to it. And it was that people were probably respecting me more, or showing appreciation, or needing me, or coming to me for support. And maybe that was inflating my ego, or maybe that was healing something in my inner child. I don't know. But I realized after a couple of years that I was enabling them by thinking I was doing the best thing for them. And when I switched my kind of approach to working with these families and clients to, I understand why you feel this way. And that comes from empathy, having that understanding. That's cognitive empathy. I understand what led you to this. I understand why this decision was made. I understand why this action was completed by you. But what's the way forward? Here are some options. What are you going to do? What resources can you get yourself? Are there resources that you physically cannot do on your own that I can support with? But what can I teach in this person? And it's made a world of a difference. So now before mat leave, being a manager of a team, there's a big difference between people that were brought into this industry that had super high levels of like extremely empathetic, way more than even me, and seeing them kind of hold people or hold families or foster children or, children of neglect in a place where they weren't progressing because, for example, if a kid lost their family and lost their home, sometimes you have to make really tough decisions, and these children have to stay in hotels when we don't have foster carers available, etc. And it's really, really hard, and someone might prefer to keep them with a family member that is actually more harmful with them because they don't want them to be feeling neglected, or someone might choose to want to take this kid in themselves, which happens all the time. And it was so much more work for me to work with these people than those that worked with a little bit more logic to be like, here's actually what we can do. And, this is a really shitty outcome, but this is what we need. This is the best for the long-term safety of this child, etc. That had slightly lower levels of empathy. That being said, though, those that had a little bit less empathy never lasted in the industry because they were like, why am I here? Like, this is so shit. I'm burnt out. I'm abused every day, and I'm done with it. So pros and cons.
Yeah, that's a very interesting journey that you've gone on, and I think that's a lot of people in care professions, I'd imagine, go through a similar sort of journey. I'd imagine people in nursing or people in charity work would start very wide-eyed and idealistic about how they want to change everyone and help the world, and then as they go through what I can only assume are very brutal, harsh experiences, they start to see things from a more logical or rational standpoint, just for self-preservation. And I wonder if the people who tend to adopt the more rational and less empathetic political position on a macro scale are also people who have gone through harsher experiences in their life. I wonder if, men who have been bullied when they were boys are the ones more likely to think, well, people have to be tough and you can't always express your vulnerability, and you always there are times in which you have to repress certain feelings because that's the way to survive, and that maybe manifests as like that's the way for society to survive. I think there are people who can empathy tugs at our heartstrings like nothing else. A good film, a good piece of music, a good video even is one that allows people to feel a sense of empathy with the characters and go through that journey with them. And then when you kind of extrapolate that out for political or ethical arguments, the empathetic position has an advantage in many ways, but it's not always the best position. For example, you take the incidents that are occurring in America, and we see videos of black men being killed horribly by police, and that tugs at our heartstrings, and everyone is so empathetic to the position of a person who's been callously murdered. But then when that manifests as defund the police, well, all the statistics show that results in more black people dying when there are no police in high crime neighborhoods. So it's very hard to make that argument often in the heat of the moment. But I would argue that there's a point at which the empathy can be a hindrance long term for the people that you're trying to help. And as you were talking about before, that you've reflected upon in your life, there are people who gain a sense of purpose and meaning from caring for others who are in vulnerable positions. But what can subconsciously be occurring is they're keeping people down. They might be, you think about, say, an emotionally abusive or controlling mother who, in her mind, in her conscious mind, is thinking, I'm doing what's right for my son. I'm caring for him. It's a dangerous world out there. I have to feed him. I have to take care of him. But then you look at it from a more rational viewpoint and you think, this guy's 32 years old. You got to let him get out there in the world and experience some harsh things. And you've got to limit your own personal empathy there for the benefit of the person that you're trying to care for. And that's where you get to the other end of the dark tetrad traits, where people are subconsciously, purposefully keeping individuals or groups in a state of vulnerability so they can feel a sense of purpose by caring for them. And it's a very hard argument to make to people that you, at least from your best experience, can observe are experiencing that phenomenon, but it does definitely exist. And that is something that I think we have to be cognizant about in what I was talking about before, this kind of performative what is often performative social justice kind of world. And we have to make sure that in any given discussion, particularly in positions of political or corporate power, there is the voice of empathy, and then there is the voice of whatever you want to call it, logic, or just the left brain. And sometimes they butt heads, and sometimes they disagree, and sometimes it's uncomfortable, particularly for the person who is higher in empathy. But the solution that brings about the best of those two phenomena that are extant within the human condition will ultimately be the best outcome. I can't see how it wouldn't be. And I guess I always think about this on a macro level, and trying to think about individual experiences where definitely when it comes to relationships as well, there's a point at which, boundaries conflict with empathy. And if you are being, unrestricted in your empathy towards someone who might be bad for you in the long term, or might have some kind of trauma, or just is a bad person, or has bad traits, that will bring you down at the end of the day. Now, there's a line, there's a tightrope there, because you don't want to be too selfish with your boundaries either, especially if you're in a long-term committed relationship, and especially if some sort of tragedy happens that no one accounted for. If someone's in a car accident, or gets an illness, or goes through something that then is going to take them years to overcome, and they're unfortunately going to have some sort of bad consequential personality traits as they overcome that. I think in certain contexts, in a long-term relationship, it's sometimes you do have to, or maybe the most ethical position might be sticking around, but it also might not be. It just depends. But you certainly can be taken advantage of if you are a highly empathetic person. But at the same time, if you don't have any empathy, you can be a psychopath. So I suppose you just have to.
What would you rather?
Yeah. Would you rather? But then at the other sort of dark end of the scale is like, if you're this empath, or you're consciously an empath, but you're actually subconsciously keeping people in a position of vulnerability so that you can feel a sense of purpose by taking care of them, which is, it's not as, it doesn't jump out to us as something that is destructive or bad behavior, but in the long term it is. And that's also associated with these kind of dark triad or dark tetrad traits.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that 99% of people that are highly empathetic, that kind of are accidentally enabling people, have no understanding as to what the secondary gain is for them. They can say, oh, well, they've gone through this and they've gone through that, but they don't understand what is the gain for that person to enable it, because it's such a subconscious thing, and it may not even be enabling it. It may just be over supporting them. And it's like you need this level of empathy for, like you said, like jobs in this care sector, nurses, social workers, therapists. At times you need that level of empathy in order, otherwise no one would work there, or you may not get the level of care that you need. And it's interesting to think about when you think about, for example, people that work in drug and alcohol. They love to hire people that have previously come through addiction or had experience with like that themselves. The same for sex worker outreach programs. They want to hire people that have previously been sex workers. However, when it comes to other things like social work, or in my industry, or even therapists or counselling, psychologists, etc., when I interviewed people, if they told me that they were really into wanting to come into this job because they themselves had been a child of the system, or they had experienced this, and this, it was always, it's not a red flag, but it always put me on very high alert whether or not it's going to be appropriate to hire that person. Not necessarily because it will just, one, be extremely triggering to them, but two, because you can only fight this. People want to work within the system to fight the system. But sometimes you have to work within the system and work with the way the system is. So we would find, we'd have therapeutic workers come in that had experienced these things themselves, and they would do everything to fight the government policies and this and that, and say, no, I'm not doing this, and no, I'm not doing that, to try and save this child. But really, and they're making fake promises. Well, they don't believe it, but they are making fake promises to these families or children, and the outcomes of that can be so detrimental. That being said, there's been many times where I rely on people's high levels of empathy in this sector in order to have the outcomes that I need. So we based our organization off this model called ARC, which is Attachment Regulation and Competency. It's a therapeutic model, and it's basically the whole concept of it is that this person is this way because of this, and by understanding this and holding empathy and compassion for that person, you can better help them. Because if you don't have compassion for them or high levels of empathy, you're going to be frustrated. And a really good example of that, and I've talked about this kid a couple times, that we had a 12-year-old boy who was living in hotels, and he had 24/7 care workers, and he'd gone from home to home to home to home. And his care workers that were hired from a different organization basically were dropping the ball so significantly, and they were getting so frustrated with him. He was a bit aggressive. He would make mess. He was extremely defiant. He had thousands of diagnoses, basically. And what I ended up doing was I got every single care worker that works with him into a room. There was like 50 of them. This is an extremely high needs child. And I sat them down and I told them the story of this kid from start to finish, everything that he had gone through, the abuse he endured, the homes, all these things. And people were tearing up, people were crying. And long story short, those issues never arised again. So whether or not, maybe that was manipulative of me, or maybe that was using empathy or whatever, I don't know. I don't care, to be honest, because it worked. Because people then left that room seeing this kid in a different light, and seeing him, instead of being a difficult child, to seeing him being as really hurt. But then, like you said, some people that are like that really naturally can get stuck into personal relationships that are so toxic and so unhealthy, where they're being taken advantage of, and people are using their empathy to get what they want. So, and I've experienced that myself, dating, a dickhead that's just something horrific, and then said, I've just been really struggling with, when I was 12, my parents divorced or something. And I was like, oh, I understand. That's so hard. And then you forgive them. Like, it's just, having extremely high levels of empathy can blur boundaries. And it's really, really dangerous game to play in that aspect, and you need to be able to hold empathy, but also hold more importantly is hold firm on your boundaries and how much of yourself can you give out to other people, because you only have so much in your own cup that you can pour into others. And self-preservation is by far the most important thing, and highly empathetic people, when they hear that, they're like, oh, that's narcissistic or that's self-centered. No, it's survival, and it's also bettering everyone around you as well. So it's a hard thing for highly empathetic people to hear. People that have a lot of logic or maybe lower levels of empathy will hear that and be like, yeah, 100%. And other people will be like, I disagree, which is fair. You can disagree with anything, but it's hard to understand when you're in the midst of it, isn't it?
Absolutely. And what you were talking about there with the analogy that's often used as the cup, and, in a good relationship, two people have their cup full and can give to the other person. But it's a zero-sum game. If you are in maybe one of these care professions and you're having to exhaust that arsenal of empathy throughout your day, through your career, then from what I've heard, it can often be very hard to be as highly empathetic with a partner. Depends person to person, and every person has a different degree of which they have the capacity to extol empathy, but that you're right. There definitely is a point to which it's detrimental on an individual relational context, and there's a point to which it's detrimental on a societal context with various political positions, which I know I keep coming back to, but I think that's just a very prominent thing that should be delved into further with the way our discourse is, especially with clickbait headlines and social media. It's very easy to market a certain political position as the empathetic one, and then you can actually weaponize any dissent. You can use empathy to. You can weaponize empathy against dissent, basically. So if a certain political position is gatekept as the only position to bring about positive change, well, anyone who disagrees with that position is considered a bad person, and that's really toxic when it comes to political discourse. That's, I guess, the bastardized version of empathy and caring about mental health, because then circumstances and mental health can become an excuse for what is objectively bad behavior. I mean, I just remember this former NRL player was literally sexting, underage boys, or on a pedophile sex hotline, and he goes, "Oh, I was struggling with my mental health." It's like, mate, there's a lot of people who struggle with their mental health and don't become freaking pedophiles.
Yeah.
So that's where the bastardized version of this culture of let's care about men's mental health, let's be really empathetic towards men and the struggle they're going through, and just people, not just men, and the struggle they're going through. Well, anyone can just use that excuse then, my mental health, and then that absolves them of responsibility for what are terrible actions to the people that you conducted those actions against, but also just there's a cost to society as well when people are excusing themselves for those actions, and that's another limit to empathy, at which point it can become detrimental. And I remember I used to do a joke. Well, it's hardly a joke. It's a bit more serious, isn't it? I'd sort of set it up by saying, talking about empathy and saying how there's a point to which it becomes dangerous, and then I'd ask the audience, "Hey, I'm gonna pretend to be someone and tell me if you feel empathy for this person," and I'd sort of put on a character and be like, I've come to the end of my road. All I wanted to do was what's best for my people and help them feel a sense of purpose and meaning, but I've failed, and it's now time to say goodbye to the world. And then I'd say, "Hey, do you feel empathy for that person?" Everyone would say, "Yeah," and I was like, "Well, I was being Hitler." So there you go.
Because such a good point.
That's what happens when you have just unrestricted empathy for anyone and everyone, because everyone has a narrative of, I'm doing what's best for me, I'm doing what's right, I'm doing what's necessary in this situation, and they can articulate that in a way that brings about a lot of empathy towards that person or that position. And it can be manipulative, consciously or subconsciously. And yeah, I stopped doing that because it just wasn't really funny and it's not appropriate in the context of a comedy show. But I think my point was made. The point was very clear.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I saw another one actually that you did came on my TikTok feed yesterday, and it was sorry if I butcher this, but it was about how who would you toxic masculinity and that you need
In the
toxic
army. Yeah.
masculinity in the military, and who would you want to protect you? Someone that wants to talk about their feelings and be like, let's kind of sit down, let's put our guns down, or would you rather someone go like be full in ready to protect, ready to fight? And it's such a good point. It's kind of spot on with this, isn't it? Is that's
Yeah.
I got the kind of concept right there, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And yeah, that joke definitely causes a stir in the comments, and I love that. But
Did it? Oh, I should have
on
read that.
on Instagram, that
Yeah.
one went viral. I always love it when a stand-up clip goes viral
Ah.
because that's always feels really nice because I put a lot of effort into those. But yeah, no, that one I set that up by asking the audience like, what do you think of toxic masculinity? And there's always people saying we hate it, we don't like it, and then
Yeah.
someone said there's too much toxic masculinity in the army, which someone actually said to me. And I just thought, surely that's the one place you need it, right? That's the
Yeah.
one place where you got to forego empathy. And
Yeah.
actually, when you delve into it, it's a really tough and hard topic to broach because there are a lot of soldiers who come back with obviously horrendous PTSD, but
Yeah.
they're just propaganda is essentially used for these soldiers to be able to dehumanize the enemy, but it's beneficial for a military group, for a group of people who are protecting a society. They almost have to be able to dehumanize an enemy, because if they're humanizing an empathy, well, the army that can dehumanize them wins. And in a competitive
Yeah.
world, which is what we do, where which is the world that we do live in, there are things that have to be, there are very uncomfortable truths that have to be employed for the betterment of society. And look, I also just want to say I've never actually sort of been in the military, and I'm not trying to, just talk on behalf of everyone who's been there. And I know we have listeners who are in the Defence Force. So,
Yeah.
well, now that this is going on YouTube, by the way, if you missed that first 3 minutes of the podcast, we are going back on YouTube, youtube.com/@sexcells podcast. Comment if if there's more nuance to whether, because some of those comments on the clip were like, well, yeah, it's those soldiers that also brutally murder people for no reason and rape women and do all sorts of horrible things. And of course, you would never justify anything like that. But when you're training, I suppose, like an elite fighting force to dehumanize an empathy and just exist as a unit and not as an individual, well, they can't just turn that off. They can't. It's very hard for these people to just integrate back into normal society. And that, well, American Sniper articulated that very well, didn't it? With the man who was that, Bradley Cooper's character was a very prolific sniper in I think it was the Afghanistan or Iraq conflict, and then came back, tried to help other soldiers with PTSD who were struggling, and then one of them had an episode and very sadly killed him. So it's it's a toxic environment, and on every side. And yeah, in an ideal world, sure, that there wouldn't be war or conflict, so we wouldn't have to suppress our empathy. But the world we live in has that, and we need to protect ourselves and
I was actually
our country, and it's necessary.
Exactly. It's necessary. I was reading up on this before about how in some ways neurodiversity or psychopathic traits, which by the way are not interrelated all the time, is so beneficial when it comes to the military, because people that are neurotypical in the military are, one, less likely to be aggressive, and two, more likely to experience severe PTSD and not be able to continue. So in some ways we need people like that in our society. If we, and I'm not going to go on about whether or not we need the military, but if in the assumption that we do, those people will flourish and may do the best. And the other ways in that there was this, I don't know how efficient this study was. I just read it briefly, but there was, I don't even know if it was a study, but it was called the Great British survey of psychopaths or something like that, where they had as many people as they could fill out a questionnaire essentially, and then they put their job title in as well. And everyone, so many thousands and thousands of participants did it. And what they found, which was really interesting, is of course people that had extremely high levels of empathy was saying that they were nurses, they were social workers, doctors were even in there, which was interesting. And another really interesting one was accountants. I don't know why, but they were right up there with the extremely high empathetic people.
Yeah. How do you minimize the tax?
Yeah, maybe that's it. Yeah. And those that had the lowest levels of empathy or the highest levels of psychopathic traits were one, which I found really extremely interesting, was the clergy, like people that like priests and pastors and things like that, which I thought that must be a power thing, like a narcissism thing. And then there was...
Okay, go on. Sorry.
Yeah, well, anyway, we'll get back to it. And then there was also surgeons and policemen, which were really high up there. So, and I thought, then I thought about surgeons and I looked into that and their traits of, and of course also there was CEOs and lawyers and people in media and TV. Those were like the top 10. I don't know if that was 10, but that's what I remember.
And just clarify, these are the people with the highest degree of empathy?
The lowest.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay.
So the ones that were highest were accountants, nurses, and social workers. And the ones with the lowest degrees of empathy were surgeons, policemen, the clergy, and people in TV, film and media, lawyers,
that's
and
true.
CEOs
TV,
of high
media.
businesses. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
Exactly. When you think about how they manipulate the contestants of maths and things like that. But yeah, then it was like, it's so important that we have neurodiversity in examples like brain surgeons or neurosurgeons, because they are more likely to take riskier decisions. People that are surgeons, I read, that have higher levels of empathy will say if there's not a high enough success rate, they will choose not to operate. Whereas other surgeons may be like, this is worth the risk. If it can save your life in the long term or prolong your life, let's give it a go, kind of thing. And so in that way, it can be extremely beneficial. And they're also more honest with their patients by saying, yeah, you're not likely to survive much longer. And just getting it straight rather than being like, we're hopeful for this, and never getting a solid answer. But yeah, I just thought that was interesting. There was something in there that I was very surprised about. But yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
I thought when you said clergy before that they were high in empathy, but the fact that they're low in empathy is very interesting.
Yeah, extremely low.
Yeah, I would have thought the opposite. For those who are high up in the Christian church. Police, it makes perfect sense. Any profession that involves some level of violence, there's definitely a limit to your empathy. Yeah, because if a violent individual who might have gone through some harsh experiences is terrorizing innocent bystanders or a neighborhood, you gotta put that empathy down. You got to do what needs to be done, and even security guards. You can't be empathetic in that situation. You got to do what's expected of you, and it's a hard job. But the men who are, well, that's always the thing with police. People say, the men who are attracted to policing are men who want power. Well, that's the sort of people first of all, what do you expect? It's a very dangerous job where especially in America where everyone has a gun and don't even know if you're going to come home that night. And I remember, just as a quick anecdote, I got stopped by the police once because I was driving an unregistered vehicle accidentally. So there was nothing really bad boy or naughty about it. It was just I was an idiot and I forgot to pay my rego or something. And then wrote me a ticket, and I wasn't sure if I could drive the car back to my place, which I couldn't, which seems a bit odd to be honest. But I went and just... The police had written it, told me everything, and they were just sitting there. This was dark, and it wasn't in like the hood of Sydney, but it was out west, and they were just sitting there. And so I went back onto the police and just knocked on the window, right? And I could see that police officer get jolted and sort of clearly was on edge because someone
Yeah.
just knocked on the window. And I really reflected on that and thought, my God, this guy is constantly living on edge. And
Yeah.
imagine if that was America. I'd be shot if that was America. A brown guy goes and knocks on the bloody window. They
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
to then extend some empathy to the police there. Well, what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to sort of take the chance that this person could have a gun and could be a gangster or a criminal, um, and just not, do what needs to be done to protect you and your partner in order to be as politically correct as possible? Or do you just not take that risk? And if someone's being erratic and is putting their hand towards their hips, well, in a split second, you got to make a decision there. You got to think, oh my God, like this
It's
guy.
my life or theirs.
It's 1% that they have a gun and they're trying to kill me. I'm not taking a 1% chance that I'm going to die. I gotta do what needs to be done. And it's a really, I have a lot of respect for people in violent professions. And that doesn't mean, you don't call out the bad apples, and it doesn't mean that there may be cultural concerns within certain professions, but, this kind of idealistic utopian vision where we'll never need the police, or the sort of the intellectual idea that the police are just a fascist organization to keep, dissent down, is just a bit ridiculous, I think. And the police really stood out to me because there's a lot of, just a lot of discourse. There's been another unknown black man killed in America, and the video is really shocking, and it was black police this time, so it's a bit of an intersectional conundrum there. But it's just it's never going to be a perfect utopia when we're dealing with policing, and it's really tough, and
it's always going to be flawed.
and it just reminds me of a quote by a intellectual called Thomas Sowell, and he said, since the 1960s, we've replaced what works with what feels good. And though I don't agree with him entirely on that, there's a lot of wisdom in that concise quote. What feels good is not always what works. And sometimes to find out what works, you have to forego empathy and just look at the brutal statistics, which can be very uncomfortable. And but for compassion, and you need to differentiate between compassion and empathy here. For long-term compassion, the best position could be something that doesn't foster the utmost empathy in the short term or in that given moment. And it's like we've said on this podcast, it can be pretty uncomfortable for people. And even on this podcast, I tend to just talk about trends and extrapolate things into a macro level. But I think I'm quite high in empathy. Like I struggle with, even being harsh towards people who haven't done a role that was expected of them. And I think I can be quite forgiving, almost to a detrimental degree, but sometimes my empathy is directed towards things that aren't necessarily what is the I guess mainstream political position, or what is the position that other people would think is the clear empathetic position. So it then causes conflict. But I know I wouldn't be good in these kind of violent professions, and I'm thankful that I live in a society where there isn't conscription and there isn't constant conflict all the time, where I, as a young man, would indefinitely be on that front line and having a fight. I'm very thankful that we, imagine the poor guys in Ukraine or Russia who were just going about their business, and now, boom, you might die. It's pretty tough. So,
100%.
sometimes what works is not always what feels good. And just coming back to, I guess, what the core foundations of this podcast, women are generally much higher in empathy. But I read that study you were talking about on the last podcast about women are actually higher in self-reported empathy, whereas men often feel a lot of empathy, but they don't necessarily report that, which really complicates things, actually, and it's very interesting. But to sometimes connect with whether it's your female partner or just women as a class. You have to articulate things in a more emotional and empathetic way, whereas men can sometimes hear that, particularly men who are sort of skew more towards male traits and think it's just childish. It's not like that. They think it's stupid necessarily. I don't think it's that they think it's lesser than, but they just listen to maybe certain podcasts that are very female skewed in terms of the audience and think, well, they're just talking about themselves. Whereas then you think about podcasts that are likely more male skewed in terms of audience. I mean, one that comes to mind could be More Plates, More Dates, or even Andrew Huberman and guys like that. That it's just a plethora of information and statistics just thrown at you. And for a lot of women, they hate that. They just think there's no actual humanity here. And I'm not trying to articulate what that experience would be, but I'm just assuming that was what it would be. And so, being able to communicate in a way that if you're I think I'm quite empathetic in my personal lives, but when I am, in a podcast or even performing or sort of trying to talk on broader issues, I do tend to be quite rational and logical, and I think as far as I'm aware, I think there's also like subconscious factors at play there, but it's worthwhile if you're like me to train yourself to sometimes speak with a bit more empathy and humanity and vice versa.
Practice neutrality.
Exactly. The sort of mantra that is subscribed to by a lot of young men who are on the conservative side of things are facts over feelings, but the best way forward is facts with feelings. I don't think just choosing facts over feelings is always could be objectively correct, but you can lose the human connection with a lot of people and not necessarily market your ideas well in a social media
That is
landscape.
So true, Neil. That 100% facts with, what was it? Facts with feelings?
Facts with feelings, yeah.
I love that. And I'm so into that as well, because obviously I'm an emotional person. But my God, do I love my studies and my research and knowing the facts and stats on everything. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's such a good point. It's such a good medium between the two. And I was thinking, this is really unrelated, but it just popped into my head when you were talking about the NRL player or some sportsman.
Oh, yeah.
And recently, it's so sad. Recently, I don't know if you heard a couple of days ago, or from when we're filming it a couple of days ago, there was a man left his baby in the car and forgot about it when it was 32 degrees in Sydney, and went to get something from the shops. Just when you're automatically driving and you just kind of on auto mode. He doesn't usually have the kid. He popped into the shops and totally forgot he had the baby in the back, and I think it was a toddler, and they died. And it's just the saddest thing. And then I saw a photo of this man, and he's sitting on the edge of the curb just sobbing. Like, oh my God, I cried. I cried for like an hour. It's so, so sad. Oh, I can't.
Yeah.
But, and then I was thinking about like, yesterday I was like, oh, and the poor family, like imagine having to tell your wife what you did. And then imagine the poor wife that she loses her child, and then he might have to go to jail, and then like, will he have to go to jail? And that'd be so slack. But then also, how do you actually prove that it was an accident? And would it be fair to not give him jail time because you feel so bad? Like what is the ethical, or what, like, do you rely on ethics or empathy, or do you rely on the law? I'm curious to see how that's going to kind of progress. I don't know if I'll ever find the outcome of that, but yeah, it's one of those things, like either way, it's just so shit. Like what way do you go in that? What direction? How do you go with that? It's so sad.
Yeah,
who knows? Yeah, it'll be interesting what happens.
It's one of those situations where it's just a tragedy all round,
Yeah.
It's very hard to, whether you attribute guilt to that person who just might not be a bad person, but did just a really bad. And then, it is just forgetting something, or just a lapse in judgment isn't necessarily even a bad thing. That's just, that's terrible. Yeah.
Exactly.
And ending on a,
and I saw it on oh, sorry.
No, you go.
You go. Okay. I saw it on Reddit, and I saw it come up on Reddit, and it like in the Sydney page or something, and so many people, men and women, were commenting saying, like hundreds being like, I've forgotten my kids in the car, but I've just was so lucky that it was a cold day, or like they were like sleep deprivation, or just any change in the routine. If you've been the one to drive your kid to daycare every single day for a year, and then all of a sudden the husband has to do it, and he automatically just drives to work and forget, like it happens all the time. So I guess that was another interesting factor, is how many people were saying, yeah, I've actually done this, but I was just really lucky.
Yeah, and how many people have
Crazy.
had car accidents just not, they're not bad drivers. They're not negligent drivers. I've scraped people. I've missed my blind spot once and nearly had a pretty bad crash actually, but at least I don't think I'm not a negligent driver. I wasn't drunk or speeding or anything. And thank God that no really major tragedy happened there. But everyone knows someone who's been in a car accident, and no one could be at fault in that situation. It could just be someone's stressed, someone's misses their blind spot, misses just is thinking about something, and they're not bad people. I don't think that's an evil person. I don't think that is even someone who, I don't know how they determine negligent driving, but I don't think that's as punishable as maybe some other people think. If it was a true accident, and there was no genuine negligence involved, it's just a tragedy all around. And yeah, I mean, how many toddlers are still run over in their driveway? It's a really horrible statistic. And I think you mentioned a few podcasts ago how many babies are sort of mauled by dogs. And it's just that's clearly obviously an extremely vulnerable stage of human existence. And
then it makes sense why they select jury at total random, so that you you never know if you're going to have highly empathetic people, or people that have no empathy or whatever. It's the only way to keep it fair. Is there even a way to keep it fair when it's people making decisions on their opinions on the outcome of someone else's life? And like you said at the start, those can be swayed so strongly just by the appearance of someone. If they're attractive, they're way less likely to get longer sentences. If they look sad and remorseful, people are more likely to be empathetic towards them. It's just like fascinating. It's so complex.
Yeah.
We could talk about this for like hours.
Oh, and I love this topic, and I think it's really relevant. But I think that's a good point to end on. And one more time, I'll mention that we do have the YouTube channel. Go subscribe, youtube.com/@sexcells_podcast. And looking forward to seeing the discussion in the comments again. And apologies that I took that off. I didn't realize how many people really loved the discussion in the comments there. So I think Neel and Jordan is going to be on a hiatus, unfortunately, for the foreseeable future. So it allows me a bit more time to organize some things on this podcast and do things like put it on YouTube. So definitely go subscribe to that. Even if you listen via audio, just go click subscribe anyway. Hopefully you enjoyed this podcast and could empathize with the positions we were taking. And we will see you next time. Thanks, guys.
See you next week.